What does that all tell you?
That the administration correctly is going big. And this is part of a campaign, Alicia, that is just beginning to unfold. This will go on days, if not a week or two. When you bring out the big guns, if you will, the long-range bombers coming from the United States, B-52, B-1, B-2, you are committing in a big way to an ongoing campaign. And that's the right thing to do. And I must say, symbolically, rolling this out immediately after the beautiful and dignified return of our 3 servicemen and women who were killed feels right to me, and I think is appropriate in every sense. You're showing that video right now, and I know they are watching and they are applauding this response, because it is the right thing to do, because in the long run, that's what will deter further terrorist acts like the one that took their own lives.
Admiral, you recently wrote, "No one wants a war in the Middle East, but Iran must be made to see that we are not afraid of one either." What does it look like to walk that line?
I think you're seeing it in real time with the administration that has carefully calibrated its moves here. They began taking very surgical, one-for-one responses. That did not affect decision-making in Tehran. Then they moved to a broader package of targeting, particularly against the Houthis and the Red Sea. Again, did not move the needle. The big change here is twofold. One, volume. You're going to see a higher level of impact points, targets serviced, as we say, from drones, from cruise missiles, from air-launched cruise missiles, and probably from bombs coming off our manned aircraft. That's a volume addition. And then secondly, and I think this is really the important point, Alicia, you're going to see targets that go after Iranian forces, not inside Iran, as everyone has been correctly pointing out, but Iranian Revolutionary Guard who are doing the training, equipping, logistics, directing. They're the on-site owners and operators of these proxies. They are now in the gun sites themselves. That's where they deserve to be. Iran, wake up, hear the message. If for some reason they don't, then we could have an even more difficult conversation in a week or so about targets in Iran. Let's hope we don't get there. That's a decision that'll be made in Tehran. I hope the mullahs are listening.
And Admiral Stavridis, it's Andrea here in Washington with Alicia. A couple of quick points. Even as this was taking place, Secretary of State Blinken was calling the Saudi foreign minister to set up his 5th shuttle diplomacy trip this weekend to the region, trying to push for an end to the Gaza war, to free the hostages, to a ceasefire, a rolling ceasefire, if you will, dealing through Egypt and Qatar with Hamas. Very complicated, and we're advised by very good sources to ignore the initial comments from either Prime Minister Netanyahu or Hamas, because they have to appease the most radical elements in their constituencies in Netanyahu's coalition, but that this is very much ongoing. Is it possible to walk the tightrope between keeping this going, but to try to do a deal, which won't happen if Iran vetoes it? It's their proxies. But to do that kind of a big deal while going after the Revolutionary Guard and Iranian assets in this very aggressive military action?
I think it is possible to do such a deal. And by the way, my hat is off to Secretary Tony Blinken, a good friend. The only person I know with more frequent flyer miles, Andrea, would be you. But Secretary Blinken has been in the shuttle mode now for months, and I think it's having a positive impact at a very high level and keeping open not only what you described, the idea of a hostage deal, but ultimately the big prize here would be coming together, at least in a kind of a framed up way, with the idea of a two-state solution. We're not there yet, but that conversation could come out of this alongside a true rapprochement between Riyadh and Jerusalem, between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I think it is a possibility, but you're correct. This is the narrowest of channels to sail, if you'll permit me a nautical metaphor. This is a tight passage. However, I think it is possible, and I'll conclude with this, because ultimately Iran does not want a regional war here. And of course, the Biden administration does not want a regional war here. And Israel has its hands full with Hamas and potential danger from Hezbollah. So at the highest level, I think there's a possibility of sailing this narrow passage and getting to a deal. Let's hope Secretary Blinken can pull this one off.
How is that complicated, though, Admiral, if Iran doesn't have total control over all of its proxies?
Great question. And this is a debate within our intelligence community. Here's how I would answer it. In the very short term, sure. The proxies have ammunition, they have drones, they have troops. But in the medium and the longer term, they dry up on the vine like grapes on a vine in a hot sun if Iran does not continue to resupply them. So again, all decisions come out of Tehran. You may see some spasmodic response from the militias, but ultimately, believe me, Tehran is controlling the purse strings, and that means controlling these militias.
To put a fine point on the complexity that we're dealing with here, we have troops on the Jordan-Syria border to prevent the resurgence of ISIS. I just wonder how we are to understand how that threat has evolved.
The Islamic State is still a nascent threat. A way to think about it that I talk to people here in the United States about is, 3-4 years ago, the Islamic State was a forest fire. It was consuming the Middle East. It had taken over huge chunks of territory in Syria and Iraq. It had tanks within 100 miles of Baghdad. That fire was extinguished, but like forest fires, there are still embers on the ground out there, Alicia. And as a result of that, the continuing deployment of 2,500 U.S. troops in Iraq, probably 700 over in Syria, very, very important against the Islamic State, the nascent embers on the ground concern. And then secondly, having the U.S. engaged with partners around the region and showing that we're not simply walking away from the region is important. Don't forget, when I was Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, I had 150,000 troops in Afghanistan, and we had U.S. 170,000 troops in Iraq. Now we're down to 2,500 troops total in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've withdrawn 98% of our troops. Pulling those last few out sends a signal to the region that we really don't want to be here. This is the wrong time to do that. I think it's important to keep our troops there.
Another quick question, since you're the military brain here among all of us. And I know you're a naval guy, but I want to ask you a question that sort of tangentially involves the Air Force. So there's been a lot of criticism already. John Bolton was on, our air at various times, criticizing the delay from Sunday to today in the response. And my experience would say, you got to wait for weather. You've got to wait for trying to limit collateral civilian damage. You got to wait for the right opportunity for whatever you're getting from surveillance. In this case, you want to get the B-1s there from the U.S. and not use regional air base if it's going to embarrass your allies. So I'm thinking about all of those things. Am I at all right about that?
Your military brain is doing just fine. We could probably use you in the Pentagon, Andrea. Hey, bottom line, we say in military operations, you want it bad, you'll get it bad. Meaning, take the time, take a deep breath, plan it, execute it with a real sense of this is going to be done right. You listed a number of factors. I'll give you another one. It's simply allow your opponents to be in a state of concern. They don't know what's going on. That actually has military advantage. To me, this timing feels about right. And as I said at the top of this conversation, it comes on top of the return of the honorable remains of our servicemen and women at Dover, where so many have come through. It feels about right to me. So I'll take your military advice over John Bolton's any day.
Admiral Stavridis, thank you so much for making